This happened years ago when I was 19. I'm now in my mid-20s. Back then, I was living 600 plus miles away from my parents in a different state. Even though there was a distance, my mom and I still talked on the phone at least twice a week, and we were still really close. So when we found out her cancer was back, I didn't think twice about dropping everything to drive down and see her. A plane ticket would be too expensive, and I had a 10-year-old Toyota that might have been a bit beat up, but it still got me from point A to point B. My parents weren't thrilled at the idea of me driving the 11 hours by myself, but my mind was made up, so they offered me a deal. I would stop at a rest stop every 2 to 3 hours and stretch my legs and call them. And in exchange for this courtesy, they would pay me for my gas. If I didn't call within the 3-hour window though, they would assume I'd been in an accident and call me repeatedly, interrupting the audiobook or podcast they knew I would have on. I accepted the deal. That's why I ended up at this particular rest stop at 2:45 a.m. This was actually one of the nicer stops. It was well lit, had multiple vending machines that didn't have huge cages around them. The payphone wasn't broken, and it looked clean. There were a couple cars with people sleeping in them. I still had 15 minutes before I had to check in with my parents. I got out of my car, stretched, and then almost jumped out of my skin when I heard a man's voice right behind me. "Miss, can I ask you a favor?" I turned around, seeing that he was leaning against my car. I have no idea how he got there so fast. I never saw him when I parked, but there he was, uncomfortably close to me. He looked like he was in his 40s. He didn't look dirty or twitchy. He was definitely standing too close, but his body language didn't scream of anything threatening. The situation at the very least was concerning, since, at the time, I was 110 pounds, 5 feet tall, and 19 years old. Even though I had already binged on a lot of true crime media and knew the dangers of a girl my age alone at night with an out-of-state license plate, I impulsively asked what he needed. He told me that he accidentally locked his keys and phone in his truck and needed to borrow my phone for a minute to call his friend. Without much thought, I reached into my pocket, grabbing my phone, until I felt a sense of possible danger engulf my entire being. Like I said, this rest stop was surprisingly well lit, and the guy looked fairly normal, until I looked in his eyes. They were dead, dark, and looked soulless, almost comparable to the eyes of a shark. The feeling of an imminent threat grew inside me as my mind raced. I immediately knew not to give the guy my phone, no matter what. I put on my best customer service smile and told him, "You know what? I'm so sorry, but I don't have a charger, and I need to save all my battery for the tracking app my parents have on my phone, and I need to call them, which I actually have to do right now, but good luck." I turned away and walked about 20 feet towards the rest stop. I quickly glanced behind me, seeing that he was still leaning against my car, watching me. At this point, I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to leave him alone with my car, because he creeped me out with those serial killer eyes, so going to the bathroom wasn't an option. I continued to run through my options, knowing that I needed to get away from him as soon as possible. I could technically get into the car, but it was risky, knowing I would have to get really close to him, unless I crawled over my passenger side seat. Then it popped into my mind to call my dad, and my dad, for the first time that night, didn't pick up the phone. When I heard his voicemail, I felt a sickening feeling form in my stomach, and I glanced back. The guy hadn't moved. He was still just staring at me. I decided my best bet was to fake a conversation with my dad. I angled my body in a position so that the guy couldn't see that I had hung up on the phone, and loudly said that I should be home in about 30 minutes, when in reality, I was still at least 4 hours away. I mentioned exactly where I was, and reassured the fake caller that this was a good rest stop, with plenty of lighting and a couple of visible security cameras. The guy still hadn't moved, and I was running out of steam on this fake conversation. In the years since, I've thought of a lot of things I could have said while pretending to talk to my dad, but in that moment, I was beginning to seriously freak out, and my mind went blank. I hung up and didn't know what to do. I had hoped that the fake call would scare him off, but he was still leaning against my car. I stalled for another couple of minutes. I bought cookies from the vending machine inside and walked around a little. At this point, he's been standing in the spot up against my car for the past 10 minutes. I honestly debated waking up one of the men sleeping in their parked cars and asking for help. Just the thought of having to wake someone up to help me get into my own car annoyed me enough that I stopped stalling and headed back to my car. I decided that, unless he touched me, I was just going to pretend that he wasn't there. He waited until I was unlocking my car door before he started talking to me again. He spoke in a non-angry or begging tone. "I really need to use your phone. I'm going to be stranded here if I can't get a hold of my friend to bring the spare keys." His voice sounded weirdly friendly, but the fact that he had been creepily watching me for way too long, while blocking my exit, was enough for me to not fall for it. I almost pointed out the working payphone, but I decided it would be best to say the least possible. As soon as I started getting in, he leaned in, trying to pry his arm between the door. I lost all nerve and slammed the door, locking it as fast as possible. He didn't move until I started the car and put it in reverse, and then he finally stepped back and let me pull out. I didn't even have my lights or seatbelt on. I was so focused on getting away from him. Then, when I was about halfway out of the rest stop, my mom called me. My mom, who was already sick, would freak out if I didn't pick up. I could still see the guy in my mirror. He was standing right next to where I was parked, with his back to me. He was far enough away that I felt okay parking again to answer the phone, but I kept my engine running and I continued to watch him. I didn't want my mom to worry, so I told her everything was fine, giving her my ETA and telling her where I was. Now that I was in my locked car away from him, I was beginning to feel like I had overreacted. She was giving me a lecture about the dangers of speeding, but I quickly tuned her out because I noticed the guy was moving. As my mom continued to lecture me about road safety, I watched the guy walk across the parking lot to a truck, unlock the door, and get in. His whole story was completely made up, seeing that he never locked himself in at all. I watched as the truck headed back out to the freeway and drove out of sight. I had to pretend that everything was fine, to not upset my mom. I didn't get back onto the road for another 20 minutes, and when I didn't speed. I didn't want to see that truck. Years later, I found out that the closest city to the rest stop is a major problem with human trafficking. I read how they target girls who look like they don't live nearby, or maybe look like they are living out of their cars. I'm extremely lucky to have made it out of that rest stop that night. During the summer, when I was home from college, I worked with a couple friends as a morning cleaner at a local movie theater. It was fairly new, built in the early 90s, with 3 big screen rooms, 4 mid-sized screens, and 3 small screens. My job as a morning cleaner was to clean all the screening rooms, during a shift that went from 4 a.m. to 10 a.m. It would take me about 20 minutes to get to work from where I lived. The theater was out in an area that was kind of in the middle of nowhere. Before the area was renovated, we were told it was part wetland, farmland, and the rest was owned by the local nature center. The first couple of weeks that I worked there, nothing out of the ordinary happened. Typically, there would only be 2 or 3 of us working a shift. There was a lot of time spent by yourself, cleaning and listening to music on my phone. Occasionally, we'd meet up with the day shift in the morning and give them a breakdown of maintenance issues that we were dealing with and other things that they'd like us to look at. One day in particular, my manager asked if we had noticed the front doors being unlocked when we arrived in the morning. When I said no, the manager went on to tell me that customers, primarily women, were complaining about a tall, lanky man in a suit that had been following them from theater to theater, and sometimes into the bathroom. Several times, women had come to the front desk, frightened out of their minds, describing a 7-foot-tall man in a black suit, wearing a bowler cap, that was following them around. There were several times that the police were called on this man. Teenagers that worked the day shift referred to him as the tall man. While he primarily targeted women, occasionally, a male coworker would catch a glimpse of him sneaking into a theater. On a couple of occasions, they would pursue him, thinking he was trying to sneak into a movie, only to find the room completely vacant. We had 12 theater rooms total, but Theater 5 was the worst. Nobody wanted to be in it. When I first started, I didn't believe in ghosts and spirits, and would laugh at my paranoid coworkers. I didn't understand why my boss was apprehensive about Theater 5, and kept assigning me to be the one to clean it out. What made Theater 5 unique was that it sat behind the bathrooms in the lobby, so to get to the sitting area, you had to walk down a long hallway before reaching the screening room. Being that far back, you were the most secluded, especially when it's 4 a.m., and the only other people you're with are on the other side of the building. People cleaning there would complain of nosebleeds, constant headaches, and a feeling of being watched. My first supernatural experience took place here. It was a normal morning. I had just finished sweeping out the lobby, and I was taking care of the cups and garbage in Theater 5. By routine, you go through and throw away leftover cups and popcorn before vacuuming and sweeping the area. As I was going through the aisles, throwing cups away, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was behind me, even at some points taking out my earphones and shouting, "Hello?" Of course, there was nobody there. Like I said, it was a normal morning, and I had no reason to suspect anything, except for a strange sense of paranoia. About 20 minutes later, I was in the top back row, sweeping out garbage from under the seats, when I heard footsteps that sounded to be running. I looked down, and at the front of the theater, I caught a glimpse of a little, blonde-haired boy. Immediately, I threw down my broom and chased after him. I ran down the hallway and out into the lobby, but there was no kid. I walked further into the lobby and saw my boss through the front entrance on a smoke break. "Who was that kid?" I asked. My boss, Jeff, looked at me. For a moment, he was confused, but then he laughed. I'll never forget how casually he said it. "So you met Charlie?" Charlie was another thing customers constantly complained about. On several occasions, they claimed that a little blonde-haired boy was running up and down the aisles in the theater, causing all kinds of noise and ruckus during the movie. Of course, it was in Theater 5. When an usher would come to apprehend the child, he would have already disappeared. The female staff affectionately named him Charlie, after his resemblance to the character in Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. Charlie was also responsible for knocking several cans of garbage over, throwing papers around, misplacing things, and generally made the morning cleaner's job a real pain in the butt. Charlie was more of a nuisance than anything. We used to theorize that he was the son of the tall man, but the two were never seen together. My only encounter with the tall man came a couple weeks later after my run-in with Charlie. I had yet to hear about him at this point. Had I known, I most likely would have quit sooner rather than later. Usually in the morning, if you're the first to arrive, it's your job to walk up into the projector rooms and turn on all the lights in the theaters. This is an easy task, except for the top floor that has several life-size cutouts of movie characters and massive posters. In the dark, it could be a little creepy. I had done this several times before, and since I was the first to arrive, I'd go about turning all the lights on. The projector area itself is dark. Typically, we'd carry a flashlight with us while going around flipping switches. That morning, I couldn't find the flashlight, so I walked through the dark hallway of projectors, flipping on all the switches. I had stayed up all night prior, watching the Andy Griffith Show. I remember because I was whistling the theme song to myself as I walked down the corridor. Once again, I got that feeling of being watched, and something several yards away, in the area with the projectors overlooking the IMAX theater rooms, was staring back at me. I stopped whistling and tried to focus my eyes. It was a cardboard cutout. They were everywhere, so I kind of dismissed it. I was about to flip the next switch when the cutout moved. I froze. What I initially thought was a cutout was actually a figure hunched over. Quietly, it was whistling the Andy Griffith theme song, imitating me, only doing it much more slowly. It rose up from its crouch, revealing itself to be at least 7 feet tall. It was a man. All I could see was a silhouette against the red exit sign lights and some of the projector computer monitors. It started walking towards me, whistling quietly. I wanted to move, but for some reason, my feet were cemented in the spot. I didn't know what to do. Slowly, the tall man stepped towards me. He walked with a bit of a waddle, as if he had a bit of a limp in his left leg. I couldn't exactly tell. He had taken about 3 or 4 steps towards me, when something caught his attention, and he turned and walked into an office down the hall. I turned back and ran down the steps and waited outside the theater until my boss and the rest of the crew arrived. That experience alone was enough to make me put in my 2 weeks. Every year, my family and I get together to celebrate Thanksgiving at my grandma's house. As a tradition, we help her set up all the Christmas decorations, both inside and outside of the house. She lived in the same house ever since my mom was a kid, so the house is very old, but also holds a sentimental value to the family. This past Thanksgiving, in particular, started off just like any other, but it took a very frightening twist that none of us ever could have imagined. I got to my grandma's around 2 in the afternoon with my mom and dad. Before any of my other family members arrived, we sat in the living room and chatted, catching up on everything from the past year, since we hadn't seen each other. About 30 minutes in, my aunt, uncle, and other cousins started to arrive. We usually gather in a smaller group, around 8 to 10 people at the most. We ate a little bit earlier than usual, since we were planning on watching Christmas movies after setting up the Christmas decorations. During the meal, I had to excuse myself from the table to use the restroom. My uncle was using the bathroom on the main floor, so I ran up the stairs to use the upstairs bathroom. At almost the exact same time I closed the door, I heard a quiet, yet very distinct, thumping noise that I thought was coming from right outside the bathroom door. I yelled, "Hello?" thinking it was my uncle or one of my cousins playing a prank on me. I've always been a jumpy person, and they've taken advantage of that to scare me in the past. I waited in silence, slowing my breath, but there was no response. While I opened the door, I peeked out of the door into the hallway, looking left and right, and didn't see anybody. I quickly searched the upper floor, going in and out of the rooms, checking behind the doors, closets, and beds. After not finding anyone, I assumed that I was either just hearing things in my constantly paranoid state, or whoever it was ran back downstairs after messing with me. I went back down and finished eating, not bothering to mention the noise I heard, since I didn't want them to torture me all night with pranks. Once we finished at the table, we decided to start working on the Christmas decorations. My grandma has always been a huge Christmas person, so she always goes above and beyond the typical person, decorating the entire house. Her stuff was scattered all throughout the house. The outside lights were boxed away in the garage, and the rest of everything was either in the basement or the attic. Everyone in the family quickly got to work, and I started with my uncle on the outside lights. After an hour or so, we finally finished the exterior lights and decorations, so we went inside to help with my mom and grandma, who were working on decorating the tree. Once we finished that, we took a little break and sat down on the couch to admire the newly lit tree. Once our break was over, it was starting to get pretty dark, so we decided to get back to work. Most of us went down to the basement to decorate it, and also bring stuff upstairs for the main floor. We brought up everything pretty quickly, and probably finished with most of the decorations in 45 minutes. All that was left was the few things in the attic, which I was asked to get. I dreaded doing it, still being a little spooked from when I was upstairs earlier, but I gathered up the courage and walked up the stairs. The attic is right in front of the bathroom door, directly above it. I pulled the little string that would bring the ladder down, and was instantly hit with that typical, musty attic stench. As I ascended the ladder, I pulled out my phone flashlight. I stumbled my way towards the light switch, tripping over stuff and brushing into cobwebs. When I reached the light switch, I flipped it on, quickly realizing that the light bulb was dead. I yelled downstairs, asking my grandma if she had a light bulb, so I could replace it. She looked around, but told me she didn't, and came upstairs, handing me a flashlight as I knelt down at the top of the attic. I wasn't really that concerned about the lack of light, since I only had to grab about 5 or 6 things. I started grabbing boxes, making trips up and down the ladder. It wasn't until my third trip up the ladder, where I could have sworn I heard a thudding noise. It really freaked me out, since it was so familiar to the sound I heard earlier that day. I stood at the bottom of the ladder, trying to listen for another noise, but it remained perfectly silent. I thought about running downstairs and telling my family, but I knew that I would get crap for it and be called a bunch of names. I worked up the courage to finally go back up and get the remaining items. There were 2 boxes left and a 3-foot-tall Santa decoration. I grabbed the 2 boxes, ran it down, and came back up for the Santa. It was in the far corner of the attic, which of course made my paranoia even worse. As I approached it, my mind raced, now noticing that the attic had a peculiar stench to it. As I was now just 1 foot away from the Santa, I instantly felt like I was having a nightmare. Hiding behind the Santa, up against a few garbage bags, was a man. We locked eyes, and I screamed the loudest I ever have in my entire life. I only saw him for a split second, but I knew what I saw. He had long, scraggly, unshaven hair on his head and face, and had this wide-eyed look of a madman. In my panicked and adrenaline-filled state, I ran backwards, tripping over bags. I made my way to the ladder, and heard rustling in the corner, realizing he was following me. I practically cleared every step on the ladder as I jumped down and promptly closed the door, screaming for help. My dad and uncle came up and quickly realized the situation. My dad stood on a chair, pressing his hands to the attic door as we heard the manic screams and pounding of the man in the attic, trying to get out. We were able to manage keeping the attic shut using paintbrush pulls as we ran back down and called the police. When the police arrived, they had us step outside so they could search the entire house. After 10 minutes, 2 of the officers came out and told us that the person was gone. They found an open window in the attic, where the man must have escaped. The drop from the window onto the garage had to be at least 8 feet, and the drop from the garage onto the ground had to be at least 15. They alerted the hospitals of anyone coming in with a fall injury, hoping that they'd be able to catch him. This literally just happened this past Thanksgiving, and neither me or my family have heard anything since.